It can be seen from the table that the growth rates of the output of the USSR industry during the recovery period were very significant. The average annual increase in finished industrial output in these 5 years reached 41%. None of the capitalist countries in the post-war period recovered their industry with such speed. The industrial production of France as a result of the imperialist war fell in 1920 to 62% against the level of 1913. To restore industrial production in pre-war France, it took 6 years, from 1919 to 1924. At the same time, she used the huge reparations she received from the Versailles Peace Treaty. It took 9 years for Germany to rebuild its industrial production in pre-war proportions, and this is subject to a large influx of foreign, especially American, capital. Thus, already in the recovery period, the Soviet economic system showed its enormous advantages over the capitalist system of economy. The restoration of industrial production in our country for individual years was uneven. The highest rates of annual growth in industrial output were in 1923, 52.9%, and in 1925, 66.1%. The lowest rates, in 1922, 30.7%, and in 1924, 16.4%. A study of this issue shows that the slowdown in the rate of recovery of industrial production in certain years was in close connection with the state of agriculture and the conditions for the sale of agricultural and industrial products. The crop failure of 1921 could not but affect the rate of recovery of industrial production. Difficulties in supplying food and agricultural raw materials strongly affected the state of industry. A good harvest in 1922 greatly contributed to the rise of industry. In 1923, the increase in industrial output reached 52.9%. In 1924, the growth rates of industrial production declined. This was due to a certain extent to the difficulties of sales that arose in the autumn of 1923 due to the considerable divergence of prices for the products of industry and agriculture, which led to the formation of large inventories of industrial goods and influenced the growth rate of industrial output. Typical for the first years of NEP was the backlog of heavy industry. This question was at that time the most acute for the industrial production of the Soviet country. The share of production of means of production in the country's industrial output has not only not increased, but even slightly decreased. In 1921, it accounted for 43.7% of large industry. In 1923, it increased to 48.1%. And in 1924 it decreased to 45.3%, and in 1925 to 43.4%. In 1925, the share of production of the means of production in the country's industrial output was lower than in 1921. In this there is nothing unexpected, because first of all the raw material base of the light and food industry was restored, since the restoration of the national economy was started from agriculture. The policy of the Soviet government at that time was aimed at the quickest restoration of industry, which produced products suitable for exchange for bread, which the peasants most needed then. This did not at all contradict the interests of the rise of heavy industry, for only on this basis the proletarian state could forcefully advance the heavy industry. Light industry since the beginning of the new economic policy has become more confident on the path of recovery. Textile, leather, fur, sugar and other branches of light industry since the first year of NEP made a sharp jump up. The output of the cotton industry, here and below, where there is a question of the production of individual industries, we mean the large-scale industry. For 1922 it increased by 144.2%, linen by 173.1%, leather and fur by 40.2%, rubber by 146.6%, etc. In 1925, large-scale industry, which produces personal items, relying on the growing production of agricultural raw materials, manufactured goods for 4,883 million rubles. in the prices of 1,926.27 against 6,074 million rubles. In 1913, the heavy industry of our country was also being restored, but the rate of its recovery lagged somewhat behind the pace of the rise of light industry. The output of heavy industry increased from 876 million rubles in the prices of 1,926.27 in 1921 to 3,356 million rubles in 1925, that is, by 283%. The output of light and food industries increased during the same period from 1,128 million to 4,333 million rubles, that is, by 289%. The renovation of equipment, the expansion and construction of new light industry factories required the creation of a developed machine building industry, a large construction materials industry, and so on. Lenin spoke of the backwardness of heavy industry in the first years of NEP. He noted this fact in his report to the Fourth Congress of the Comintern. Lenin pointed out that heavy industry in any capitalist country usually required large subsidies. The economic history of the capitalist countries proves that in the backward countries only long-term $100 million in dollars or in gold rubles could be a means for raising heavy industry. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume XX7, p. 348. Speaking about the tasks of restoring heavy industry in our country, Lenin stressed, the heavy industry needs state subsidies. If we do not find them, then we, as a civilized state, I no longer speak as a socialist state, have perished. IBID, p. 349. In this regard, Lenin pointed out that the proletarian state should strictly save on everything, and on the state apparatus by reducing it and on all other government expenditures. We save on everything, even at schools. IBID. From these statements of Lenin we see that the question of heavy industry occupied an exceptionally large place in the policy of Soviet power all the time, but he acquired a special acuity by the end of the recovery period. During the Civil War, the production of metal was particularly bad, although this industry was rapidly recovering, but in terms of its level, it continued to lag far behind pre-war production. In 1925, 35,000 tons of pig iron was smelted against 4,216,000 tons in 1913, that is 36% of pre-war sizes. Only 2,135,000 tons were smelted, compared to 4,151,000 tons in 1913. The iron and steel industry at that time was only just beginning to gain momentum. In 1924, only 755,000 tons of cast iron were smelted. In 1925, the production was doubled. From these data it follows that the decisive branches of heavy industry have not yet reached the pre-war level. The question of the metal industry was specially put on the discussion of the 14th Party Conference. In a report to the activists of the Moscow organization of the RCP-B on May 9, 1925, Comrade Stalin pointed to the exceptional importance of the metal industry. The growth of the metal industry is the basis for the growth of the entire industry in general and the national economy in general. Lenin and Stalin, Collection of Works to Study the History of the CPSU, Volume 3, p. 26. The party has set the task of turning our country into a metal one. The whole working class undertook the task of carrying out this task under the leadership of the Bolshevik Party. During the recovery period, not only the restoration of industry took place not only in the pre-war period, but also on the previous technical basis. During this period, there was also a partial reconstruction of industry. The technical base of a large industry was gradually changing. Electricity quickly penetrated the industry. The capacity of power plants, especially district power, was systematically increased, and the coefficient of their use increased. Summarizing the electrification of the country, Comrade Stalin assured the party at the 14th Congress that, based on the electrification rates taken, the Galru Plan will be fulfilled as scheduled. As you know, it was completed ahead of schedule. On the basis of advanced technology, the renewal of state-owned equipment began. Some industries have made a significant step in the technical re-equipment. The most significant in this respect was the oil industry. In 1913, the Russian oil industry was dominated by the most backward way of mining, tarting. It covered 90% of all production. Oil production by compressors was almost absent. In 1925-26, only 22.9% of the total production was harvested, 29.5% in pumps, and 16.5% in compressors. From these data we can see how far the technique of the oil industry has advanced. The reconstruction of the coal industry began. Small handicraft mines were closed, mining of coal in which became obviously inexpedient. The funds released for the coal industry's rise were directed mainly toward the restoration and improvement of the operation of large mines. Such a measure at that time was fully justified. It ensured the most productive use of capital investment and the soonest rise of the coal industry. Before the war, coal was not mined by coal cutters. In 1925-26 there was already a fair amount of these machines in the Don base. The data given indicate the great work done in the field of rationalization of production. Restructuring on the basis of modern technology, industry has begun to fulfill its tasks of reorganizing agriculture. During this period, the beginning of the production of tractors inside the country was laid. In 1922-23, the first 2 experimental tractors were produced. In the following year they were produced 10 pieces. In 1924-25, 481, and in 1925-26, 813. The former Putilov plant acted as a pioneer in the technical re-equipment of the country's agriculture. It should be noted that agricultural machinery in our country grew during the period of the recovery period much faster than other branches of heavy industry. In 5 years of the recovery period, coal and oil production doubled, and plows, 7 times, seeders, 7 times, 1922, 1925, harvesters and mowers, 26 times, and threshers, 38 times. The socialist industry rapidly expanded and strengthened its industrial ties with agriculture, re-equipping it, creating a new technical base for the agriculture of our country. Mechanical supply of agriculture in 1925-26 was expressed in the amount of 123.5 million rubles. In just 1 year, the agricultural machinery fleet was updated by 15%. The data presented indicate technical and economic changes that have occurred in individual industries. However, this was only the beginning of the reconstruction of the national economy. The main task for the implementation of reconstruction was yet to come. Despite the rise of industry and the involvement of workers in production in the country, there was still unemployment. At the end of 1923, there were about 1 million unemployed in the cities. The unemployment that existed in the USSR was a temporary phenomenon. The main source of its formation was the village, throwing into the city relatively unnecessary labor and agriculture. Unemployment that existed in the USSR prior to the victory of the collective farm system in the countryside can in no case be identified with unemployment in the countries of capitalism, where it is the inevitable companion of capitalist production and where the unemployed make up its reserve industrial army. The cyclical development of capitalist production is impossible without a reserve army of labor. Production in the USSR does not know the cycle, it knows only one way: a systematic and continuous movement forward. Production in the USSR does not need a reserve army of unemployed, its nature is alien to unemployment. During this period, capitalist rationalization of industrial production was intensively carried out in the most important capitalist countries. This rationalization led to a reduction in workers, increasing the army of the unemployed. Unemployment in these countries during the general crisis of capitalism has become chronic. The situation was completely different in the USSR, where socialist rationalization, ensuring the rise in production and labor productivity, was accompanied by a significant systematic increase in the number of employed workers. At that time, even the large-scale industry of the USSR was not socially homogeneous. In the industry there was a struggle between the elements of socialism and capitalism. Several forms of economy were represented in it: socialism, capitalism and small-scale production. Along with private capitalism, there was state capitalism. Concessionary enterprises operated. The share of concession enterprises was small. In 1924-25, there were 14 concession enterprises in the industry, where 4,531 workers and employees were employed. These enterprises gave gross output of 11.5 million rubles. In 1925-26, the number of concession enterprises increased to 52, and the number of employees in them increased to 15,714 people. In the same year, they gave 0.4% of the gross output of large-scale industry, or by 35.4 million rubles. In absolute terms. By the end of the recovery period, the first results of foreign capital activity in the USSR have already been determined. The international bourgeoisie in the war against the Soviet Union was defeated. The struggle was moved to the economic field. Concessions, Lenin pointed out, are nothing but a new form of war. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume XXV, p. 511. The concession is a kind of war, struggle, competition of two forms of economy. Here there were two worlds, socialist and capitalist. In connection with the assumption of concessions in the Soviet country, Lenin pointed out that as long as there is capitalism and socialism, there can be no peace between them, either one or the other. For a certain period of time, the war with weapons and tanks was replaced by an economic war. The share of concessions in the gross industrial output was negligible. But nevertheless, their role in the struggle of the classes was considerable. Concessions did not yield the desired results. Many of the concession enterprises did not comply with the agreements concluded with the Soviet government and applied primitive means of production. Under these conditions, the main goal, which was pursued by the Soviet authorities, was not to acquire the technical culture of the West and America. But that is not all. Many concessions were used by foreign states as residences of their espionage agents. For example, as it turned out later, the agents of the concession Metrovik carried out active wrecking work to destroy our power plants. During the process of the Trotskyite spies in January 1937, it was discovered that the Trotskyites were connected with foreign firms. These firms used the possibility of legal penetration of their agents into our country for espionage sabotage activities. Through the concession of the firm, Lena Goldfield's trader Trotsky in 1926 contacted the British intelligence service, becoming her agent, a spy. The counter-revolutionary connection of the Trotskyites with these firms shows that some of the foreign concessions were used as a link between the sabotage and espionage activities of the Trotskyites and agents of foreign intelligence penetrating into our country. These facts confirm the depth of Lenin's instructions that concessions are the same war, only in other forms. On July 5, 1921, the decree of the Soviet government granted the Gubernurkoses the right to lease small-scale industrial enterprises to cooperative organizations and private individuals. 7,449 enterprises were assigned for leasing. By the end of 1923, 76.5% of this number had been handed over. In terms of the number of leased enterprises, the first place was food and leather. These enterprises did not require large investments, they worked on local raw materials and for the local market. Among the tenants at that time, private individuals predominated, 52% of the total. 30% of tenants were former owners. 37% of these enterprises were handed over to cooperatives, including labor cooperatives. On average, one worker, leased in 1923, had 17 workers. In all enterprises leased by private entrepreneurs, in the same year, 80 to 90,000 workers worked. Russian industry in 1923, Yearbook of the Supreme Economic Council, pages 43, 44, 45. The gross output of private capitalist enterprises in the factory industry in the first years of the NEP grew in absolute terms. In 1923-24 it amounted to 198.6 million rubles, in 1924-25 253.7 million, and in 1925-26 362.9 million rubles. At the same time, its share in the output of the factory industry declined. In 1923-24 it was 4.37%, in 1924-25, 3.7%, and in 1925-26, 3.62%. As can be seen from the data given, private capital only increased its production in the factory industry by 82.8% in just 2 years. The number of workers in capitalist enterprises also grew to a certain extent. Some of the workers, who did not find use for their work in state enterprises, had to go to work for a private entrepreneur. Private capital also used this circumstance to strengthen the capitalist exploitation of workers, trying to circumvent the laws of the Soviet government on the protection of labor, exploiting minors, under 16, violating the 8-hour working day, not observing the rules of labor protection, etc. Private capital, looking for easy and quick gain, discovered in all its nakedness a predatory speculative character. The capitalists approached the matter in such a way, to disrupt as much as possible and do it as soon as possible. In this way they destroyed the equipment. Among the artisanal artels in 1926 there was a significant number of wild cooperatives, i.e., not part of the system of industrial cooperation, and thus avoided state control. Of the 1,065 wild cooperatives surveyed in Moscow, 10% turned out to be false operatives who exploited hired labor. In general, in the trade cooperation at that time there were hired workers 47% of the total number of workers in it. All the activities of the Soviet government aimed at limiting the capitalist, predatory trends of private capital, met with frantic resistance from the latter. The class struggle in industry unfolded and intensified not only between socialist and capitalist enterprises. Within each capitalist enterprise, there was a struggle between the workers and their capitalists. The Trotskyites and Zinovievites denied the socialist nature of the enterprises of state industry, considering them state capitalist. This heinous slander against the state industry was completely exposed by Comrade Stalin. Comrade Stalin showed that state enterprises are, in their type, consistently socialist enterprises. They are represented not by two opposite classes, as is the case in capitalist enterprises, but one class is the working class, which owns the means of production and is not exploited by anybody, the working class that works for itself, its proletarian state. Along with enterprises of a consistently socialist type, belonging to the state, there were also socialist enterprises at that time, based on cooperative ownership of the means of production. In cooperative enterprises, of course, excluding pseudo-cooperatives, there could also be no capitalist exploitation of someone else's labor. By their nature they could not serve as a source of enrichment for individuals. Another thing, private capitalist enterprises. There are two classes in them, as well as in the state capitalist ones. The exploiting, capitalists, and the exploited, the proletariat. There can be no question of the common interests of these two classes, the social gulf between them is impassable. The class struggle in private capitalist and state capitalist enterprises under the conditions of a socialist offensive against the capitalist elements was constantly aggravated. Private entrepreneurs capitalists sought to shift their failures and defeats in the struggle against socialist enterprises onto the shoulders of workers, strengthening their exploitation. Using all sorts of tricks, they lengthened the working day, forced the workers to work in unsanitary conditions, avoided the hiring of trade union members, and so on. Relying on Soviet legislation and the power of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the trade unions organized within the private capitalist and state capitalist enterprises of working masses, which gave a proper rebuff to the capitalists, fighting for their vital interests. The successes of the Restoration period were a cruel blow to the capitalist elements in the national economy of the USSR. Relying on the restored large-scale socialist industry, the working class of the USSR intensified its offensive against capitalism. The class enemy and his agents, the Trotskyites and Bukharinists, all tried to prevent the restoration of the national economy of the Soviet Union. Despite the high growth rates of socialist industry, the enemies of Bolshevism, the Trotskyites, proposed, at the end of the recovery period, to take super-industrialistic fantastic rates. These proposals had a clearly provocative, counter-revolutionary character. They proceeded from the Trotskyist counter-revolutionary position on the so-called initial socialist accumulation, which, by analogy with the initial capitalist accumulation, must occur at the expense of the ruin of the peasant economy. With their super-industrial delirious ideas, the Trotskyites attempted to provoke a conflict between the working class and the peasantry, thereby disrupting the alliance between them and leading the revolution to ruin. The Communist Party, implementing the behests of Lenin, under the leadership of its leader Comrade Stalin, exposed the Trotskyites and led the working people of our country, after the end of the Restoration period, along the path of socialist industrialization. The Soviet country for the first 5 years of the NEP came very close to the solution of an even more grandiose task, socialist industrialization as the basis for the reconstruction of the entire national economy. Summing up the economic situation of the country towards the end of the period of the restoration of the national economy, Comrade Stalin said, "Now we have about 4 million industrial proletariat. Of course, this is not enough, but it is still something to build socialism and build the defense of our country on fear of the enemies of the proletariat. But we cannot and should not stop there. We need millions of 15-20 industrial proletarians, electrification of the main regions of our country, cooperative agriculture and highly developed metal industry. And then we are not afraid of any danger. And then we will win on an international scale." Lenin and Stalin, Collected Works for the Study of the History of the CPSU, B. Volume 3, p. 27. Already at that time the foundations of the Stalinist policy of socialist industrialization of the country were laid. The party was preparing for a new stage in the struggle for socialism. The main task of the new economic policy at that time was to build the foundation of a socialist economy in conditions of a developed trade turnover. In the first period of the new economic policy, from 1921 to 1925, the party and the Soviet government approached this task primarily from the point of view of the rise of agriculture. It was impossible to build the foundation of a socialist economy without the creation of a powerful, advanced industry. But we could not begin with the creation of a large machine industry in the first period of the NEP, because the necessary prerequisites were not created for this. Soviet power began to restore the national economy in conditions of extreme shortage of bread, fuel and raw materials. On the basis of the restoration of agriculture, the food issue was resolved, which ensured the influx of workers to factories and created conditions for a serious increase in labor productivity. The resolution of the food issue played a decisive role in creating the necessary fuel resources. The rise of agriculture restored the agricultural raw material base of industry, the production of cotton, flax, leather, beets, etc. It also served as the basis for the growth of ore, oil, logging, etc. Having resolved all these questions, the working class fully activated, the movement is a cash production machine of a large industry, which inherited it from the old system. Further forward, he could go only by reconstructing and expanding his industry. The center of gravity has shifted to the industry. Now the progress of the entire national economy has already rested on the industry and, above all, on the production of means of production. Agriculture itself also could not go forward without new agricultural machinery, tractors and other industrial products. The Restoration period had, as noted in the short course of the history of the CPSUB, three significant shortcomings. First, he dealt with old factories and factories whose technically backward equipment was wearing out and required updating based on advanced technology. Secondly, the industry of this period relied on a narrow base, because the machine-building industry occupied an extremely insignificant place in the national economy. Thirdly, the recovery period brought light industry to the road first. Further development of the latter also rested on the weakness of heavy industry. All this led directly to new tasks, which first of all consisted in rebuilding existing enterprises and creating new means of production, thereby focusing on the development of heavy industry. The country entered a new period of NEP, during the struggle for the direct implementation of socialist industrialization. The 14th Congress of the CPSUB, December 1925, summarizing the recovery period, took the policy of industrialization of the country, the development of the production of the means of production, thus opening up a new page of the heroic struggle for socialism.